back to the Builder's Bench, where construction meets politics. I'm Craig Larkins, and we're now in week 3 of the federal election campaign. This week, we're taking the conversation east to Toronto, where Ontario holds 122 seats in Parliament. Joining us from Toronto, John Mollenhauer, President and CEO of the Toronto Construction Association. Also from Toronto, we welcome Lindsey, editor for Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. And from Ottawa, Louis-Philippe Champagne, Associate Vice President, Public Affairs and Industries Practices for the Canadian Construction Association. Welcome to the show.
Hello there.
Thanks for having us.
You know I like to start with the polls, LP, so let's jump right in. Any changes, any surprises this week?
You know, I'm running out of ideas on how to present the polls. This is our third week. We're starting there. And, there's only so many ways to tell that the Liberals are doing pretty good. I will put a caveat this time around, and I'd like to turn people's attention to the main poll aggregators in Canada. There's two, generally speaking, trusted source when it comes to looking at your polls. CBC has acquired a few years back Eric Grenier's platform, which used to be called 308. They have a pretty robust tracker on the CBC website. Very surprising number we have there with a projection of 204 seats for the Liberal. This is a massive, massive majority. The biggest it's been so far. I do point out a second aggregator I like personally, which is 338 Canada by a teacher in college in Montreal. A slightly more conservative number here at 192, still very much in the majority range. What I want to turn people's attention to today is the specific voting intention for the two large parties. So the NDP and the Bloc are still having some challenging time, but what we see now, especially if you look at 338, is a bit of a correction that seems to be starting to happen, where the Conservative are up 1 point and the Liberal are stagnant at 44. So what I think we can read from that is that the Conservative seems to have came down to a point at 30-some percent, 38%, where they hit their grassroots movement. They've hit a point where the people that are fed up with the Liberals, that are tired of Justin Trudeau, that really want to see a change of government, is that basis that is not going to move no matter what. And then that swing vote that they lost to Carney in the beginning of the campaign seems to have stabilized there, which, as I pointed last week, we might be at a point where Liberals spiked away too soon, and now we'll just be going in a slow decline. We'll see if that happens, or if, again, the vote crystallized too early, and then the debate might be the big question next week to define these polls.
All right, thanks, LP. So last week we saw what President Trump called Liberation Day in the U.S. His tone has noticeably changed, with no more talk of Canada becoming the 51st state for now. And notably, Canada was excluded from the global 10% tariffs, but Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles are still being hit with a 25% tariff. So John, let's talk about the trade war and its possible impacts on the poll. So far, it appears to be giving the Liberals a slight edge, as someone would say. If the tariff talk continues to cool, do you think the advantages start to fade for the Liberals?
Of course. I mean, that's an understatement, I think. Just go back for a moment to a couple of things that were mentioned. One, the annexation threat. I don't believe we've heard Trump mention that since the response to Ford on August 11th, or on March 11th, I think it was, when Ford threatened to stop electricity exports to the U.S. And I haven't heard anything, unless I'm missing something, on annexation since then, which is interesting. That's gone quiet. And the other thing you mentioned briefly that's gone quiet is there's been relatively little from Trump about Canada recently. The recent March assessment threat that the U.S. did, which talked about, the drug war and all the things Trump loves to talk about, no reference at all in any of that to Canada. So, yes, if the emphasis shifts away from an election campaign that's focused almost entirely on the trade war, then that disadvantages the Liberals and advantages the progressive Conservatives. And it's interesting. I mean, they're as it stands today, our with all, we've got a 37-day election. That's a very, very short election period. So somebody like Carney, who has little political experience, probably would be at a disadvantage getting on the campaign trail, talking about housing and all the things that matter most in our country: inflation, cost of living. So I believe that the Trump has a long history of making bold statements, misrepresentations. He's done it before. He did it with China. He did it to get elected this time around. Mm-hmm. And in 2020 he did it. He talked about the fact that China's economy was growing at 4, maybe 5 times the speed of the U.S. economy. He talked about the fact that China held $1 billion worth of U.S. debt, and said that the only way to right that wrong, he portrayed that as, one of the greatest injustices the world has ever seen, and said that he needed to be elected in order to right a wrong, and it worked. He's had a history of doing things that way. So what will happen if it stays quiet, or there's little likelihood that it'll just go away entirely. But if the focus shifts away from the trade war, and even the trade war itself, I think people are beginning to understand that it's the fear of the tariffs that has driven costs up more than the actual tariffs. We watch suppliers and trades that are afraid they'll be held accountable for a number that they put in before they have a handle on what that really looks like, adding 8, 10, 12, 20%. And the impact, the financial impact of tariffs is much, much less than that. On large multi-res, mixed use, the actual cost impact of the tariffs, and it's not the tariffs, of course, we export very little, it's the countermeasures, but it's more in the order of 2.5 or 3%. So it will be interesting to see. I think there are 2 possible outcomes, from my opinion. Number 1, the emphasis remains on the trade war, and that continues to be on the front burner, in which case my best guess is we have a Liberal majority government in Canada. If the emphasis shifts away from the trade war, and it moves far enough away from the trade war that we start talking about other things, then my best guess is we have a minority government. Obviously Liberal or Conservative, but minority governments have become commonplace in Canada. We've only had, I think, 3 majority governments since 2000. LP, you would know better, but
yeah, sounds about right.
And you don't get much done with a minority government. You make it very difficult for them to meet campaign promises. Anyway, I'm interested in what you guys think, but that's my opinion.
Lindsey, let's hear from you.
I think there's an interesting couple caveats there. John, I agree with you largely for the most part. I think right now, Carney and potentially his political team may want to be considering continuing the discussion on tariffs as it regards with the auto sector. I mean, you've got a couple of ridings in particular that are pretty important in Ontario when it comes to the auto sector. So obviously that's on the periphery of construction, but I think, if he wants to keep that in focus, that's one way to do it. Keep the tariff discussion in focus, that's one way to do it. I think we're starting to see a lot of different announcements coming to the fore from all the parties, actually, with regards to, combating the housing crisis. And, you have, I think it was Pierre today saying that he's going to really reduce the application process for large resource and energy projects. So you have that kind of pivot, if you will, while still tying in the tariffs because they could be trade-enabling infrastructure, all the while trying to appeal to the masses when it comes to affordability. So for me, I'm really interested to see if LP's, projections could be correct when it comes to seeing, the Liberals have peaked and they might be slowly starting to come down, or whether, they're going to hold steady and we'll see what the ultimate outcome is. I mean, polls are always a good little snippet in time, if you will, but they certainly aren't always a direct indicator of what will happen.
I will say, Craig, if you allow me,
Yeah.
I agree with both of you guys, and I very much agree with what John said in terms that it's not so much the tariff right now that's impactful. It's the scare of the tariff. It's the uncertainty that we've been living through our sector and the economy at large that has been, transforming our supply chain, transforming the way we buy in Canada or change our protocol for procurement. This has already been important and caused some damage. I will also agree that Mark Carney's campaign is heavily designed around the response to tariff. He's been pointing himself, even through the leadership campaign, as this Team Canada captain, the guy that knows the economy, that can stand for Canadian. If all of a sudden that goes away, there's a significant risk for his election. I don't think he has much of a platform yet beyond that. I'm told that the Liberal will release their platform later this month, and the Conservative will most likely do it first this week. But still, I don't think the average Canadian will go out to vote and say, I want to vote for Mark Carney because I want more of Justin Trudeau or because I want more Liberal governance. They go there saying he's the guy we need against Trump. And interestingly enough, I think he's suffering from his own popularity in the U.S. John, you just mentioned how Canada hasn't been a key focus of so-called Liberation Day. I would say that it's still significant impact when it comes to that 25% on the auto sector. I think this will decimate North American car manufacturing if it stays in place, not just for Canadian, but for American companies, most importantly. The steel tariffs are still into place. That is a serious concern for that sector and to an extent to our industry when it comes to steel structure. But really, what I will say is the main reason why Canada was not on these two charts of all the nations that get tariff back, in my opinion, it really come down to that Truth Social post that Donald Trump put out 2 weeks ago now, where he says, first of all, name the Prime Minister of Canada by his actual title. That was the first time he didn't call him a governor for quite some time, saying that Prime Minister Mark Carney had a great call with him, and then go on to ramble on the bright future there is between Canada and the U.S. for business and economy and politics. So you can have all the suspicion you want there. I wasn't on that call with Mark Carney in the White House, as you can imagine. But I think the fact that Mark Carney spent significant time of his life in New York, either with Goldman Sachs or with Brookfield, probably has a lot of good friends in high places in these big companies in New York. And let's keep in mind, Donald Trump is not a career politician. He hasn't been governor or senators for 2 decades like previous presidents were. He is a businessman from Manhattan. So clearly the people around him, his key advisor, the people he trusts from back home, might be people that are in good relationship with the Carney campaign and saying, hey, you know what, this guy can work with us. Let's support him. Hence that post on Truth Social, hence the reduction of Canada's threat to the 51 state and whatnot. So I think, in a way, Mark Carney might be soon suffering from his own good.
I want to stick with that partnership theme there, LP. And back to you, Lindsey. Ontario recently had a provincial election where Doug Ford secured a majority government. So we've all seen the diner photo op. They're sitting cozy in that favorite diner of Mr. Ford's, I believe.
Yes.
Do you think Ford's presence could influence how voters lean federally, and just presence overall for the campaign?
That's a really good question. I think that Ford has been largely quiet for Ford when it comes to the federal campaign in particular, in reference to Pierre and the Conservatives. Like, he has kind of stepped back and he hasn't really said an entire, pitch for the Conservatives federally or anything. He says, quote unquote, he's swamped, he's too busy. And in fairness, he has been busy, ultimately banging on the drum when it comes to the whole tariff thing, which was, a big part of his campaign to get elected provincially in the first place. So for me, he's also said that, he's worked with Carney on these premiers meetings and he's had these, constructive conversations with him too. So honestly, I think Ford's, towing the line, if you will, waiting to see the outcome himself without really, throwing these large vocal announcements behind the Conservatives. So it's an interesting take. I expected him to be a little bit more vocal, and he hasn't. So,
LP, John, did you want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in. I mean, I know Ford well, and I've known him for years. And Ford, the only person more strategic than Ford in terms of their timing is probably Carney. Carney calling a snap election is brilliant.
absolutely.
Or Trudeau or the Liberal Party calling a snap election. It doesn't give us time to talk about things about which Carney probably knows relatively little. Ford was pretty clever. He chose to run a provincial election at a time that almost guaranteed his overwhelming success. And he's a get it done guy, and it was good timing that way too. He's been more vocal than any of the premiers in Canada, and more aggressive, and I think is respected for that, whether you're a Ford fan or not. So I love what he's done. You talked a little bit, Lindsey, about the tariffs, the auto trade impact. You mentioned, Craig, the steel and aluminum. They're huge. The focus was on them. It'll shift again when the focus is elsewhere, but it's huge. It'll keep the focus of this election if he doesn't back down on either of those. Certainly in key ridings, places like Windsor and Oshawa, it'll have an enormous impact on how they vote. They're too affected by what's happening to not be influenced heavily by the auto tariff or the steel and aluminum in Hamilton. And we're certainly seeing that. And make no mistake, that's huge. I just think things will soften a little bit. And I think people are beginning to understand that the cost impact. When I look, for example, in Toronto, I look at high-rise residential, which is a massive amount of construction in Canada. 60% of the volume of construction, and we have 242 tower cranes. The impact of the actual tariffs on the cost of construction there is probably 2.5 or 3% tops. And there are a great many disruptors that people like Poilievre and Carney should be talking about, looking at the election through the lens of the construction industry, that have had a greater impact. We have a housing crisis. We have a labor crisis. The labor crisis is enormous. It's already north of 85,000 in Canada, with baby boomers retiring, too few folks coming into the industry. That number is expected to be horrific, like 350,000 by 2030. So that's a big disruptor and has a cost consequence. The housing crisis, I mean, the numbers that were released by Buildforce Canada were frightening, and by CMHC. They said we have to build at least 3.5 million more homes than we will build between now and 2030 to return Canada to affordable housing, the availability of affordable housing. These things are affecting construction, and in a big way. Interest rates, we've talked about interest rates and the fact that they've come down, and inflation is more stable, not nearly enough to make a difference and see that return. So maybe people will figure out that it's not just about the tariffs. And Trump's history. I mean, Trump comes in aggressive and softens over time and gets outcomes that he would otherwise not have achieved. That's his the way he gets things done, and Republicans in the U.S. love him for that and recognize that. So the rest of the election is going to be really interesting. Between now and April 28th, I expect a great many things could change. The numbers could go up or down dramatically overnight, depending on what happens.
One thing is sure is that this election matters. Like we've been almost conditioned in Canada to have election campaign that don't really matter. We know the outcome before it starts. This was almost the case. If Justin Trudeau would run, I think there would be no doubt on anyone's mind who would be the next prime minister.
It's probably the most important election in 50 years without a trade war.
Mm-hmm.
And now the trade war is global. The focus isn't all on Canada anymore.
Yep.
And there are only roughly 200 countries in the world. He's taken them all on.
Yeah. And some of the big ones, like, again, I don't have the charts in front of me, but you'll remember from that second page, China, the entire European Union with substantial tariff application, something.
Sri Lanka, 44%.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's gonna be challenging time for the U.S. And at the end of the day, whether Canada is listed on that chart, we are the closest partner to U.S. even still today after all that threat. So it speaks volume when we think if the economy of the U.S. is about to take a serious drop right there, well, Canada will be suffering from that, right? We're not isolated.
No, and I think, what Carney's also meeting strategically with other countries and trying to navigate this future where the U.S. isn't exactly who we, rely on as much as we have in the past. So I think whoever ends up becoming the next Prime Minister of Canada is going to have to think on a completely different level than we've ever seen before when it comes to partnerships across the globe. And we may see some major changes there, but even on, on the Canadian level, interprovincial barriers need to be lifted. We need to change that tune quite a bit and alleviate some of our own pressures that we've put on ourselves. So it's actually almost a way for maybe a cathartic experience, albeit a little bit dramatic, for Canadians to look inward and see where we really need to change and help ourselves.
I would say very dramatic, not little.
Yeah, true though.
Winston Churchill said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste."
There you go.
Sure,
and the trade war has created a crisis that I think has perhaps allowed us to shine a light on some things that ought to have happened years ago. Mm-hmm. Our heavy reliance on trade with the U.S. is just strategically bad business. And I think you mentioned, Lindsey, that Carney is off this week to talk to the president of France, and then he's off to the UK to talk to the Prime Minister of England. He isn't waiting to be elected to have those conversations, and good for him. That bodes well in the election. But the low-hanging fruit in all of this, when the U.S. elected Trump, and Trump predictably goes, he's the architect of chaos, global chaos. He's doing what Trump does. And by the way, I met the man in August 2007. I had lunch with him. We were at a groundbreaking for what was then the Trump Tower. Trump had a management contract for the hotel and a minority interest at that time in the development. And we went to the groundbreaking. I was with Eb Zeidler, who was the architect. And I met the man, and it was pretty clear to me when I met the man that he gets what he wants. And he's doing that. But as Canadians, I think I'd like to see us both all our conversation is about, obviously, Poilievre and Carney at the moment because nobody else is going to win this election. But the focus shouldn't just be on diversifying trade. That's kind of a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. And as you said, Lindsey, it should also be on eliminating interprovincial trade restrictions. That'll help our economic output. Huge, massively, and it's decades overdue. So I think some good will come of all this, even the trade war.
The opportunity and the crisis. So I wanted to get on the ground in Ontario and talk about some key battlegrounds. Obviously, the tariffs impacting the auto industry. What are the communities? I'll start with you, John, because you did mention some of the key areas to watch. What's on your mind in regards to that?
Well, maybe I could cherry pick just three to keep it short.
Sure.
Start with the most obvious. Windsor West is, the auto hub, maybe that and Oshawa. And the recent, 25% is my brother used to be in the auto industry. That can grind the auto industry to a standstill. Their suppliers, for example, and my brother owned a company that was in that business. And when COVID hit, the auto manufacturers have zero tolerance. If something can't be delivered in accordance with the contract terms, on time, at the price committed, and now you layer on all this disruption and they can't possibly deliver. So Windsor West will be a fun one to watch, and it's also an interesting one to watch because it's gone back and forth quite a bit. It'll be a genuine, nail biter war, I think, and it'll be fun. So that's battleground number one I wanted to mention. Oshawa is pretty similar, so maybe I skip that. Brampton East is another really interesting one. It's gone back and forth, and you can elaborate, LP, a little bit because you know the intricacies of what's going on there, but that's always been a hot battleground during a close election, and will again, I think, be in Ontario. Peterborough's kind of a fun one, and maybe I'll close with that just on this discussion to allow others to talk. But Peterborough has elected an MP that almost always comes from the party that ultimately wins the election. That's kind of a useless piece of information, but interesting and kind of fun.
Interesting if you want to make a bet on it. You never know.
Yeah.
Could be good that way.
Yeah. Anyway, that's just to sort of zero out a few, but there will be 8 or 10 really good battles, I think, in Canada in electoral district.
Mm-hmm.
LP, Lindsey, who wants to jump in here first?
Well, I think if you look at Ontario, John covered the main one for sure. It's the unique reality of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, is quite something politically, right? The core of Toronto and a good chunk of the many ridings they have here tend to be much more progressive in a way, right? A lot of Liberal seats, a lot of NDP seats in some case, but don't underestimate that crown of the GTA for the Conservative. Stephen Harper understood that. Many of his ministers understood that quite well. I think Poilievre could make serious gain here if their national number would return to that kind of low to mid 30 range, which I think is very much possible still. If you look across the country, we have a number of regions, sometimes the entire province, that are really in swing mode. We talked about BC last week, right? How BC started with a rather strong NDP that was taking a lot of votes away from the Liberals and Conservative ahead. That has then changed. We're now seeing the Liberal ahead in BC, despite the fact that they have basically no brand awareness at the provincial level anymore. There's no more Liberal Party of BC. But it is mostly due to the NDP taking a serious drop in BC right now, even though they are in power provincially. I think that speaks to something I don't think that's a political term, but I always call that political transference, where it's very difficult for a premier to have a prime minister of the same party. And the same can be true for prime minister and president in the US. I think what damaged Pierre Poilievre's campaign in great part is that people associate him with Trump. If Trump would have lost, I think, trade war aside, Pierre Poilievre would go up in the poll because they would compare him to Kamala Harris if she would have won. Same thing is true for Doug Ford here. I'm not saying he's supporting the Liberal, but a Liberal prime minister is a much better opponent for Doug Ford than having someone like Poilievre in office. In terms of swing riding, I will mention Edmonton Southeast, Mohamed Sohi, the former minister returning to office after his term as mayor of the city. I think that's a legitimate win for them there, a good seat for Alberta. And of course, all of BC is up in swing right now. So that's interesting for some of the key figure of the NDP, most notably.
Yeah, I'll say we did have a very interesting provincial election in the fall where, as you just mentioned, the Liberals did dissolve, and it's kind of the murky waters right now, as I can say. But on the day we're recording this today, Mr. Carney is actually meeting with BC's premier and having a rally in Richmond. So I think both Mr. Poilievre and Carney are in BC at the same day while one's jetting out. Lindsey, did you want to weigh in on that?
I think just to kind of tack on to what everybody was here was saying, I think it's also interesting that Carney's in BC as well to talk about the lumber challenges, because I know David Eby is very concerned about that, and the possible implications as it relates to home building on both sides of the border. So I just thought I would add that in there because there's a little bit of a construction hook to it that also could be a broader implications of tariffs in the current state of the economy. But I think rounding back to Ontario for me, having worked in Peterborough years back in my community newspaper days, it is always a very interesting little spot, if you will, in Ontario as it goes on the political spectrum. So I'm very curious to see if it indeed history holds true, and whomever is elected as an MP there ends up being from the same party as the Prime Minister. So
well, they do. Peterborough's a nice mix of rural and urban.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And that's one of the reasons that it's such a good crystal ball for what's going on federally.
Sounds like Peterborough's the
100%.
place to be.
Craig, if you allow me to go back on the
for
policies
sure.
announcement, because what Lindsey just said there about the forestry in BC and the impact on housing, I think is a great segue to that announcement we briefly mentioned last week on the second episode, where the Liberal campaign announced a significant housing strategy. And I think we can't not have a discussion about this, because now that we had more time to look into this and have discussion with our partner, there's some serious concern with that announcement. And I'm not here to make a political statement for or against any party, but it's great that the Liberal says there's a housing crisis, we need to do something, we'll announce some substantial capital investment into it. But there's two things that jump to me. First of all, they claim that the federal government should be a developer. I don't think it's the role of the government to start and be a developer to begin with. They should make sure we have the proper economic situation in Canada so that the private market really rise to the job. Putting $25 billion into a new agency to build more homes, I'm not quite sure about that. I think it's a great investment that could have gone to the housing crisis, better targeted to the key issues that create the crisis to begin with. And I'll come back to what John just said. I'll let you speak, John. I know you're excited. 500,000 housing start per year is what's required to close that gap, the 5.2 million home. We have never came anywhere close from that. Our record year was 1974 with 250-ish thousand. In order to get there, we need to change the way we build home, and that comes in great part by making sure municipalities are properly funded to do so. There was no announcement on how they would help municipalities found that infrastructure they need, the water treatment plant, the sewer, the water main, like we've seen in Calgary last year, utilities capacity. And we are very adamant that without proper municipal financing framework, we will not see more home building because there's nowhere to put those homes.
Extremely valid points. And the one I agree most with is the Liberals proposing to get into the development business. As a former contractor and a former developer, I can assure you that is the most fiscally irresponsible move they could make, because it needs the innovation and entrepreneurship of the private sector for the math to work. If they want to put money to it and subsidize affordable housing, absolutely. But by becoming the developer themselves, it probably costs them more to build than it would ever cost the private sector. And I think that's true of absolutely anything, anywhere. But it's a fun conversation to have. You talked a little bit about what's going on in BC. I just wanted to jump back to that, because I think the Liberals were kind of leading with a fairly strong lead in the polls in BC, and I think that's really been narrowing. And I think that's why they're both paying close attention to it. Out east, there's probably a Liberal sweep. Ontario accounts for a little over a third of the federal seats. That's one they're focusing on because, as we pointed out, there are lots of that could move back and forth a ton. I think we've seen in Alberta the Conservatives lead narrow a little bit. Things are starting to change a little bit. It's getting interesting, and all that probably means is, if as long as the emphasis still stays on the trade war, it still looks like a Liberal majority. Really, I think that's what will change the flavor of the federal election, and we're down to the last 30 days, so it would have to happen soon.
So LP, you kind of touched on this earlier. What do you think is going to change the excitement of this campaign this week? Is there talk of any party platforms coming out? What's going to switch the gears? We're kind of in this, I don't want to say a lull, but it's not as exciting as it could be.
Yeah, I mean, for construction, it's been a good few weeks of campaign. We had so many good announcements for us on trading big infrastructure, on energy corridor, on shovel-ready project, on both sides of the parties. But I think everything's about to become much more interesting. We have 21 days left for the election. This is not a lot of time. We have to go to 2 debates, French and English debate, April 16 and 17 respectively. That's just next week. Party, as we hear it, will release their own political platform, which is much more relevant than specific announcement like the housing announcement and trade enabling, because they have to presumably put some number behind them, and then you can see a bit of the big picture, what it would mean for the Canadian debt and the budget at large. That will most likely happen this week as well. So I think in the matter of 3 weeks between now and the actual ballot, we're going to see some really strong activity, which, again, to my earlier point, will either take the Liberal down with them or solidify them and get them in that lead to get that strong majority. We should have an interesting time ahead.
We should also point out that advanced polls open April 18th. So that's next week as well, right after the debates. John or Lindsey, did you want to weigh in on that? An injection of excitement.
I think the debates are going to be really, really important. They're always a colorful, from a journalist talking, they're always a way to add some color to, stories and whatnot. But I think it's how they really go after one another's promises and campaigns. I mean, I think we can kind of guess the tone. Probably, Pierre and Mark Carney will take. I think we have a flavor of that as we've seen it, but I still think the performance of these debates is pretty important. And covering the highlights from it and seeing where that goes will be interesting in what I do agree is starting to be a little bit of a, we've had a little bit of a lackluster component so far. So I think we'll have a little bit more color there, which I'm looking forward to always. And you can't discount the NDP and the Bloc either, and all those. They still have lots of comments and things to make. So, and I feel like that provides good fodder too.
John, you briefly mentioned as well on the local candidate component, local candidates, kind of the tariff effect, kind of distracting from that side of things. And we really haven't seen that local star shine, I guess you could say.
Maybe I'll talk about the debate and whether I expect it to be interesting or not, and I don't.
Of course you don't, John. Of course you don't.
And then answer your question.
All right.
And I'll tell you why. If it's a minority government, it'll be difficult to get things done and meet campaign promises. I expect that the PCs will talk about the Ring of Fire and all the stuff they've promised around that. The Canada shovel-ready zones, they'll brag about that. The more boots, less suits. The remove sales tax on homes, which the Liberals will also do. The National Energy Corridor. The PCs will talk about the trade-enabling infrastructure and the reducing the GST for first-time buyers. They'll talk about the Build Canada homes. It's very predictable, I think, and they're very different people. They'll go back and forth, but I think as Canadians, we should be doing what we tell our politicians to do, and that's kind of take a long-term perspective to get context around what's really important. And they won't, and it won't be discussed much that day. At least that's my sense. And to your point, Craig, about our parliamentary system, we don't elect a prime minister. We have, through whatever it is, 343 ridings or whatever it is in Canada, and whoever wins those horse races, or the most of them, will form the government or be asked to form the government. It's not like the U.S. where you vote for a president. And I think we should be paying more attention to that so that we get the right people in Ottawa, because I honestly look at what I expect will be the Liberal platform and what I expect will be the PC platform, and what I see are two shades of the same color. We now have blue Liberals and red Conservatives. They're talking about all the same things around the big issues, and I think they'll just talk about that. I'd love to see us talk more about, we haven't mentioned today the War Cabinet. Carney's 24, cabinet ministers. I guess that'll all change in any event after the election, should the Liberals win. But it's interesting. He's certainly proving that he will meet his promise of reducing the bureaucracy cost. He's going to a much smaller cabinet, 37 or whatever it is, down to 24 or 23, whatever that number is. I'd love us to pay more attention to the locals, though. They're the people that need to speak for us and make a difference. And Trump's going to be around for 4 years. And tariffs are going to be around, although we're going to be on a roller coaster with tariffs. It'll remain a front burner issue, and as well it should. But there are so many others, and they're serious.
Yeah.
This election would have been the most important in 50 years without the trade war. There are that many concurrent disruptors.
And it's easy to focus maybe too much on the U.S. tariff discussions and everything around it. But what remains true regardless is that Donald Trump will most likely be in office for 4 years. There's not a situation where that changed. And I'm not going to be the guy defending Trump. I think he is smarter than he looks, and people don't always give him credit for that. But what I will say is, I don't think he's the cause of what's happening in the U.S. I think he's the symptom of a transforming U.S. population, especially in some state, that we've seen over the years, especially in the Obama government and then leading into both administration of Trump. I wouldn't be surprised, even if Trump vacates politics after a second mandate, that J.D. Vance or some other of his followings take that MAGA hat again and keep that movement alive. I think there's a lot of Americans, appropriately so, that says we're a bit tired to be the world leader on everything and to pay for defense of the rest of the world and to pay for commerce of the rest of the world. And that's what has been allowing President Trump to surf on great number across the U.S. It's something we need to realize. For many years, people have been, putting inflammatory comments saying that there's a civil war brewing. I don't think it's that bad, but there is a sharp divide between rural and urban U.S. And this is in way true in Canada as well.
Lindsey, any final remarks?
Well, I just think that, to echo LP's point, we need to obviously pay close attention to the dynamic in the States, not even just Trump, but among the broader scope of the political sphere, as well as the general public over there. With that said, we need to be listening to Canadians here on the ground too. What I think is paramount, and maybe it sounds cliche, but we need to see what that voter turnout's going to look like this election, and we need to see, that's going to be obviously the biggest deciding factor. But at the same point, as John has said, I think everybody on this panel has said, this election is so important, and not just because of tariffs, but because of so many other pressing and important issues that we can't just rest on our laurels. We've had not great voter turnout over the years, let's be real, provincially and federally. So that, if I could beat on any drum, it would just be the importance of getting out there and voting. So for me, that's what I really think we need to reiterate to the Canadian public. So.
John, LP, any final thoughts?
On the voter turnout, I think there's something worth to be said. Last week, we discussed the demographics of the conservative supporters and how they're appealing much more to the youth, which will be an easier group to get out on election day, which is why I think the Liberals probably right now are getting ready to get out the vote in advance polling. What I will say is what John mentioned earlier, saying, having a majority government really give a clear mandate to govern. I think many Canadians will think the same and will say, even if my party is guaranteed to win, maybe I want to go out anyway to be sure it's a majority. So I know last week I said otherwise. I said, well, it's going to be hard for the Liberal to get people out if they're so high in the poll that it's basically guaranteed victory. I think more and more Canadians says we need to make sure it's a majority, blue or red, so we can go against Trump and really have a strong agenda either way. So very much agree with Lindsey. They're looking forward to see what the turnout is and how easy it is to get people out to vote.
John.
I mean, we talk about Trump a lot. He's not going anywhere. He's going to be there 4 years. The Americans wanted to shake things up. Otherwise, they wouldn't have elected a man that's been convicted of a felony. He's been impeached twice. I mean, how does Trump get elected? Now, I agree 100% with ULP. He's a smart man. I've met him. Trust me. He is a very bright man and a very different man one-on-one than what you see on the TV. That's the way he approaches it. It's unheard of. I mean, he was mentored by the crazy criminal, that Roy Cohn. Read a book on Roy Cohn. You'll know a great deal more about Trump. He's not going anywhere. If we have a majority government in Canada, wouldn't matter which of the two parties it was, they will have the wherewithal to arm wrestle with Trump, and ultimately both countries will realize how important our trading partnership is and will continue to be. If we have a minority government in Canada, I think it'll be difficult because we may have, and it likely won't be the NDP anymore, it'll likely be the Bloc.
I think so.
And that's an important, I mean, he's a decisive guy, Blanchard. I would have been scared of that if he was talking again about separation and all this. He's not talking about any of that stuff. He's a smart man. I don't think it'll be the NDP that becomes ally themselves with whoever is successful. Should it be a minority government? I agree with LP. Just to close, I hope people get out and vote. Because, my dad used to say, if you don't vote, you're not entitled to a political opinion.
Plain if you don't vote. That's what I always heard.
Yes.
And I kind of think Canadians are recognizing that we may need a majority government.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, that could influence the outcome as well. It's going to be an interesting 21 days.
Well, and just bringing it back to construction, 1.6 Canadians are employed in the industry. That's 1.6 million votes. It does matter. And as LP and I like to say, do your research when they come and knocking on your door. That is your moment to have that conversation with those local candidates. So prep yourself, do your research. Again, advanced polls run from April 18th to 21st, that is. Thank you all for joining us today. LP and I are back next week with Duncan Williams from Halifax and Chris Atchison from back here in BC for our episode 4 leading up to the debates next week. Thank you very much for joining us.
Enjoy.
Cheers.
Thanks for having us.